Hi everyone. Today we'll be having a session on adjudication. I think you've spent some time having sessions about uh, debating largely how arguments are made in terms of how different types of motions exist. We've done a one on like POIs and responses. So you've got a basic idea of how these debates work, what sort of arguments are generally made, how do you make them. You've done one, I think, mock in general. So you've also applied whatever you learned in debating as well. Now we'll move on to the other side of this activity, which is adjudication, which is basically you going ahead and taking the other role, which is going ahead and judging debates. And I think we've already discussed how judging is as crucial a part as debating, which means you can comparatively judge in tournaments as well, and you don't require any sort of experience for that. It's as debating works the same for judging as well. You go ahead and judge, and you compete within that. And there are certain things in terms of how you go and judge. What are some things to remember? How do you give oral adjudications? All those things. Uh, the basics of all this, which are something which we're going to cover today. Um, so yeah, and one thing I do want to note before we start with the first slide is that the way you go ahead and treat adjudication needs to be like need to give it as much importance as you do give speaking and debating per se, because within this activity both are equally important. And I think we all can probably say doing a lot of judging and edging in lot of tournaments has also given us a wide perspective in debating as well. So these both are activities which help like each other a lot as well. The more you judge, you get more clarity about what you need to do as a speaker, and vice versa as well. So which is why this is extremely important to have a larger grasp of. Cool. Doubts along the ways, you can unmute. Same things apply. Cool. We'll begin with the first slide now. You can move to the first one. Yep. So what you're going to start with is getting the basis of who is an adjudicator and what is the exact role within that. And the first concept we're going to cover within this is an ordinary intelligent voter. So what I want you all to understand from this is, in terms of, let's say you go ahead and do judge and you act as a judge, what does that exactly mean? First thing is you have to act as an ordinary intelligent voter. So that's the first sort of role you pick up. Mentally, you need to probably see yourself as an ordinary intelligent voter. What that means is something which you're going to understand. First is that you have to be aware of the basic facts about the world. What do these basic facts look about, right? For example, Syria is in the Middle East, India is a lot like in the Asian continent, things like this. Which means as an ordinary intelligent voter, you're required to be aware of the basic facts of the world, things like where a country lies, which continent it lies, and all those things, right? Second is that you be familiar with issues and events that have made international headlines for a sustained period of time. And this is important, so as to say that we all are aware that COVID, for example, had happened for a couple of years when it started, roughly around those things, right? It was a pandemic which had a severe impact on individuals and countries all along those lines. The important thing to note is what is the depth you need to know within this. I think the first thing to be aware of that the existence of COVID-19, as an example, of course, is something you do need to be aware of. That's a general thing which is happening around the world and is something you're required to be largely aware of at least. The second thing within this is, and we're going to talk about the depth of this, judges should be expected to know that different countries had different models of response to COVID-19, with some countries deprioritizing the economy and implementing lockdown, and some countries prioritizing keeping the economy open and relying on individual social distancing. This all might sound like a lot of information about COVID. What we are trying to tell you is that as an ordinary intelligent voter, your role is to know these basic things, because I think we can all accept that things like, oh, countries did act in certain ways to prevent COVID-19, it did affect individuals, are basic facts that I think all of us do know. Any ordinary intelligent person will know that COVID-19 existed and different countries had different responses to COVID-19. So the example we've taken up is of COVID, but don't go get confused with the depth you're going within that. The larger thing to understand is that you, as an ordinary intelligent voter, as a judge, should be familiar with the existence of these issues and the basic facts about them. Like they have like affected countries, countries have reacted in different ways, etc., etc. So basic facts about the world are something you're required to have a knowledge about. That's something which your ordinary intelligent voter should know. So think of it like this, right? I think it's safe to say that an ordinary intelligent person, like average individual, will know about these things, right? Will know about COVID-19 existing, which means the same sort of burden or same sort of expectation is also put on you as a judge when you're judging. It's simply that, right? If an average individual knows about certain facts, which are like existence of this, Asia lying in which continent, sorry, India lying in which continent, things like these, the same sort of expectation is also put on you as a judge. That's what you have to understand in terms of what we when we talk about familiar with basic issues and the events that have recently taken place. What do you not need to know? Let's take the COVID example, right? The last line. They do not necessarily need to be aware of the specifics of individual models each country has implemented. This is important. And this is where we talk about the depth of what you need to know, right? You do need to know that different countries dealt with COVID differently, and that's a very basic fact. You do not need to know how each and every country had exact specific models to deal with COVID. For example, not like South Korea had a very specific model in which they wanted to track every individual. Other countries are more liberal in their approach. All these things. These all are things you are not expected to know as an average, ordinary, intelligent voter. But you do need to know that, alag countries, different countries had different approaches. So this is the difference, right? Being familiar with basic issues and the basic facts about the world is different from you having an in-depth knowledge about something. So this is the basic difference you need to understand, that the expectation on you is only to know about the basic facts which are existing in the world and not extreme amount of details within that. So this is not to say that, oh, if you do know details about certain country, that's automatically a bad thing. But the larger burden which is put on a judge who has to then act as an ordinary intelligent voter is that you need to be aware of the basic facts around the world. That's what you need to largely understand from this. Cool. Just wait. Let's move to the previous slide first. Any doubts on these two things? We will go to the other points then about what being aware of basic facts largely means before we go on to the next slide. You can put it in the chat. You can unmute, whatever works. I'll wait for 10-20 seconds and then we'll move on to the next slide. If you understood, you can just give me a quick thumbs up. Another example. All right. Okay, wait. Cool. I think a recent example would be that as an ordinary intelligent voter, you are required to know that there is some sort of conflict obviously going on within Israel and Palestine. What you are not required to know is what is exactly happening on a daily basis. That, oh, today this is the latest update, tomorrow this is going to happen, etc., etc. But the existence of that conflict in recent time, jo 2 हफ्ते पहले हुआ है, or it's been going on, the existence of the basic conflict has to be something which you are aware of. So that's the difference. As an ordinary intelligent voter, you are required to know that this is a conflict which is going on. You are not required to know what is happening in detail within that conflict on an everyday basis. So this is the expectation which is put on you. And just to like simplify this, right? What we're talking about is like in terms of who is an adjudicator is that when you do judge, what are you required to, what are the things you are required to have? It's very basic. You have to be any ordinary intelligent person in the world, which means any individual at least know about the existence of this. That's the simple burden which is put on you. You do not need to know like intrinsic details of that. So certain basic facts about these and basic facts about the world are something which you do need to know as a judge. And the examples I'm giving is not like, I'm not saying these are the things you need to know. These are larger examples than any recent events or any current events are something which an ordinary intelligent voter will know. And similarly, the expectation is put on the adjudicator. Cool. Any other doubts here? Perfect. We can move on to the next slide now. Cool. Also, just to confirm, Chirag, are we recording? Because I don't see the recording saying here.
Yes, we are recording.
Perfect. Cool. 4-5 points here as well. First is you have to avoid utilizing personal knowledge that they have of the topic unless it could be reasonably be assumed to be held by someone who fulfills the previous two criteria. I think in the previous two criteria, you've gotten to know what this basic expectation is and what do you need to know of the basic current events. What do you need to then avoid? You need to avoid having in-depth personal knowledge of something. For example, if I am somebody who has some sort of personal independent knowledge of a historical event or of a current event which is going on in my country or my region, I have to avoid having too much like or letting that run on my mind constantly when I'm judging a debate. But it can be all right if it fulfills the first two criteria. If it's only a basic fact, then it's fine. But if it goes into details of me having some personal knowledge which is very in depth, that is something which needs to be avoided to be used. And this is where I want to make the difference. It's fine if you do know certain things. It's fine if you do have personal knowledge, but you have to avoid that being a part of the judging process. You have to avoid those details being utilized by you as a judge when you're judging whatever the points the teams are putting forth. So what you're expected to know is the basic awareness of those facts. and nothing beyond that. If you do know, that's fine, but that can't be a metric or expectation which is put on every edge out there or every person who does judge. So that's important to understand. Second, you have to give little credit to appeals merely to emotion or authority, except where these have rational influence on an argument. I think a lot of times when teams are presenting arguments, they do use a lot of emotional appeal. They do use a lot of how do you say, like, in terms of the way they're speaking, the methodology which they're speaking, to necessarily catch your, like, the emotional quotient of that emotion, right? To probably catch your emotional appeal, or to catch your appeal largely, or be authoritative in the way they're trying to put forth that point just for the effect of it. So as a judge, you are not required to give credit, a large amount of credit to things like these, because I think we've already learned basic that this format, parliamentary debating, is largely based on logic and not on the basis of the way you speak or the method you take to speak and all those things. I think we've discussed in depth what that necessarily looks like. So similar expectation here. As a judge, you have to give little credit to appeals which, like, appeal to this emotional quotient or the authoritative figure when they're trying to put forth a point, except where they have rational influence on an argument. This second part is also very crucial, because sometimes within certain arguments which are being put forth, I think use of emotions is necessary to give impact on the argument, or is necessary a framing which the team is giving to the current world. If they're trying to put forth that the current world is struggling, or certain x number of people are struggling with certain impacts in today's world, there will be emotional value which they will try and derive from that. The difference is that this sort of emotional appeal is actually them trying to impact a sort of argumentation which is based on logic. So I think that sort of crediting this sort of emotional appeal is fine to the extent where it's contributing to the argument and not going beyond that. So if I'm trying to emotionally appeal you as a speaker on literally everything I'm saying, or I'm trying to just win on emotional appeal by saying, oh, this is good because, this amount of emotion, that's something you have to give little credit to. But if my emotional appeal is crediting a logically made argument, the way you make argument, the way we've also discussed those things, right? I think that is something you can give credit to. But other emotional appeals which are arbitrary, or which are just trying to appeal you emotionally without any contextualization into an impact or an argument, that is something you have to give little credit to as an edge. And I think it boils down to an edge being an objective individual, not having biases and all those things. We'll discuss that as well, what do not having biases look like. But the objectivity has to be maintained. So whatever we are learning right now is ways in terms of how do you avoid certain things to maintain that objectivity, which is why we say avoid utilizing personal knowledge, give little credit to emotional appeal and authoritative appeal and all those things. These are all paths to understand that you have to be very objective as a judge when you're judging debates, and not let your preconceived notions take part in the way you're judging that debate. You have to judge the debate in terms of what is being said by teams, and not by anything that you probably know prior, or by the way they're trying to put forth their points. So merely on the basis of what they are necessarily saying. So ये जो हम सारी चीजें we're studying or we're trying to like gather here are all sub parts of that larger notion that you have to be an objective edge, right? Third thing is avoid presuming a geographic, cultural, national, ethnic, or other background when assessing arguments. So this is so let me like explain this very clearly. In terms of when a debate is going on, certain debates probably always have some sort of geographic contextualization already given in the motion. Maybe they're talking about a specific context, specific region, specific culture, all those things. But I think as a judge, in debates which are neutral or which are away from all these things, you as a judge can't presume or just assume that this is being set in a particular cultural context or a particular geographical context, or what they're talking about or what the people they're talking about are from X ethnicity or Y ethnicity, which means all presumptions of you as an individual of what this could look like, where this could look like, has to be set apart. So this is not to say if the team is logically explaining to you where this debate takes place, that's something you're going to like say that doesn't matter because I have to stay away from geographic details. What we are saying is that your assumptions and presumptions of where this could take place, it has to be stayed away. You have to judge on the basis of what is going on in the debate, and not let your preconceived biases or your presumptions that motion pada, you think that this will probably affect this ethnicity of individual. These sort of presumptions have to be kept away when you're going ahead and judging a debate. It has to be judged on the basis of what is being logically explained by teams within the round itself, and not from your preconceived notions largely. So any presumptions on a geographical conflict, cultural context, national context, in terms of where this is taking place, or the people we are talking about, all these things have to be avoided when you're going ahead and judging arguments and assessing the argument which are being made. Fourthly, You have to avoid preferencing arguments or styles of speaking that match personal preferences. So I think, of course, it's required for you to be an objective individual while judging, but it doesn't mean that we all don't have personal preferences. Obviously, there are certain preferences we do have, maybe our political ideology, maybe certain contexts which we have a large, strong opinion on. So it's not to say that you can't have those opinions independently, but when you are judging a debate, you have to avoid having preference to certain arguments or certain styles of arguments or certain styles of speaking when you're judging. So as to say that it's a debate going on, maybe one side is presenting argument that's something which I intuitively as an individual agree with, or they're speaking in a way which I like a lot. Maybe they're speaking extremely slowly, and like in detail. That's something I generally like, and I like it better than people who speak faster. That does not mean I will credit this team more than the other automatically just because they're speaking the way I like. Which means your personal preferences of, let's say, certain arguments or the way an individual speaks has to be kept apart when you're judging debates. It has to be judged objectively and not on the basis of personal preferences. And to be very honest, it's very easy for these things to come forth because, of course, there are personal preferences. And if you are don't keep these things in mind, it's very easy for to get swayed by certain argument because you necessarily agree with them. If I have a very strong political opinion on something and a team put forth a point which is on the lines of that political opinion, it's very easy for me to say, oh yeah, that's right, I agree with that. But that does not mean it has to translate in me crediting them over the other team automatically, which means you have to avoid giving preference to arguments or styles of speaking or any other thing that just automatically match your personal preference. You have to still remain to the core of being objective and being absolutely neutral within that debate. And this is also part of an ordinary intelligent voter, that you have to be an ordinary intelligent person in the debate and not let your preconceived notions about, oh, I like this argument come into the picture when you are judging. Lastly, you have to assess the merits of a proposed policy, solution, or problem separate from any personal perspectives in relation to it. So I think in a lot of debates, which are, let's say, a policy debate, this house will take up X policy, or it's a this house regrets debate where you have to present a counterfactual or a solution to a problem. All those things, you might have some personal perspectives in it. Again, not to say this is different from having like preferences, because I think in preferences is like, oh, I prefer this over the other, but having a perspective maybe like that, oh, I don't think this is absolutely rational, or I don't think this can actually take place, or I don't think this is a very good solution to the problem, or all those things. These are things which have to be kept away when you are going ahead and judging the merit of a policy. Let's say it's a policy motion. The way you judge the merit of the policy or the demerits of the policy from opposition has to be independent of your personal opinion on the policy. So for example, if there's a debate about having a two-child policy in any country, irrespective of whether you agree with the policy which government team is putting forth or the way they're trying to implement this policy, your personal preferences does not have to come forth the way you judge that argument. Oh, I don't like the way this policy is being brought up by government, hence they lose to opposition, or hence not only lose and win, hence the value I want to give this to the argument reduces, because it's not only you have to say, oh, winning and losing, you also have to judge independent arguments. Does this team prove this argument? Does this team compare this argument? Does this team provide analysis to this argument? So just because what they are saying in their policy or solution does not align with your personal perspectives in that, does not mean you're going to discredit that argument or discredit that policy. You have to judge the policy or solution or whatever it is on the merit of it independently, and not let your personal perspectives come in forth or come in like a part of that sort of judging in process largely. So these two slides may be a lot of stuff to absorb. The larger objective of these two slides will tell you that the first burden which is put on you as an adjudicator is to just operate as an ordinary intelligent person, not somebody who has extreme knowledge, but not somebody also who has no knowledge. You have to have certain facts and awareness or knowledge of an ordinary intelligent voter, an ordinary intelligent individual who probably knows XYZ things, who probably has to have awareness about basic facts of the world, but it is not required for you to know every detail of the event going on. But then these are the five things which we further discuss, that avoid you have to avoid using personal knowledge that you may have, because of course, let's say I have stayed in a particular place where this debate is being talked about, I have past historical knowledge of the place, I have to avoid using that when I'm judging the debate. I have to give little credit to emotional appeal when it is being used by teams, until unless we've discussed how it influences an argument or supports an argument, and other presumptions of where this debate is taking place, whether I like this style of speaking or I like this argument, or lastly, whether I think this policy can work or not. Basically, your individual perspective has to be kept away from the merits of the argument itself and the way you have to judge it. You have to judge the debate in terms of what both teams are saying, independently of your own opinion. That's the larger end goal of these two slides to tell you. We've given you 4 or 5 ways this may happen: your personal preferences, geographical background, context, personal knowledge may be utilized. But the larger idea is to say that your subjective opinion and your subjective mindset on certain things has to be kept away from the way you objectively judge a debate. Any doubts here? Give little credit to appeal. So, okay, second point is largely simple, that any sort of emotional appeal which is largely done to influence you as an edge, you have to give little credit to that. You have to largely objectively see the argument without this sort of emotional appeal, until unless that emotional appeal is contributing to an existing argument, is a part of the logic that the team is trying to give. Anything else? Just not giving credit to larger emotional appeal until unless it contributes to an argument. Just independent emotional appeal you don't have to give credit. Cool. If all clear, we can move on to this next slide. Right. So this is where we'll talk about role of an edge before debate. So before a debate starts, what are the things you need to go ahead and know? Cool. You can move on to the next slide. Okay, couple of things here. What do you need to have prior clarity about? There are 3 large things here. One, what is the trade-off which is demanded by the motion? Trade-off means that what is the debate about, and what do you have to probably lose within the debate as a team to go and prove something which is more important than that? Because in every debate, I don't think any side can prove every single thing. They obviously will take certain trade-off that, okay, you know what, even if this doesn't take place, this other thing is something which we feel is more important to the round, and this is the most relevant thing. They'll probably provide arguments or analysis within that. The example we'll take here is just give me a second. Cool. The example we'll take here is this house believes that art should be seen as inherently democratic. The first thing you need to probably go ahead and understand from this motion is what it is demanding from you, right? What is the larger idea of the motion? Is that art is something which every individual should have an access to, or it's democratic in the way where I don't think only certain individuals should be allowed to see certain art forms. Every individual should have a democratic right to probably view art or be a part of the art making process largely, right? So in this sort of motion, what do you need to have prior clarity about? That what is the demand by the motion? That probably on side gov, you are saying that there has to be an inherent democratic value to art, which means inherently, intuitively, just what the concept of art is should be democratic. Which means if the trade-off looks like that, all right, maybe the certain prestige which art holds, that only certain people can view it, goes away, we are fine with that as long as more people get access to it. That's the sort of trade-off gov has to take within this debate. What do you as an edge need to know? You read the motion, you need to first of all know what both sides have to argue or what trade-offs both sides are taking. Gov is saying that we have to make art less prestigious, and it is something which should be seen as inherently democratic to all individuals. Opposition has to probably go and say that we are fine with art not being seen as inherently democratic, but rather only even if only certain people have an access to it, it's rather fine. I think this is a basic understanding of what both sides looks like and what the demand of the motion is on either side. Okay, one side is arguing that it should be seen as inherently democratic. Other side is saying that inherently should not be seen as democratic, and we are fine with that. That's the difference in terms of the demand by the motion or the trade-off which the motion is asking from you, which should be understood at both sides. So this is basically saying that if a motion exists, you need to know what both sides have to argue within that and what is the side which they are necessarily supporting. The second thing here is the motion type, because I think we all have an understanding of what different motion types looks like. THBT motion, this house will motion, this house supports, all those things. I think we've discussed all these things, right? Which means if there's an example, for example, this house believes that there should be creation of a separate living space for disenfranchised citizens of respective countries, and the other motion is this house will create a separate living space for disenfranchised citizens of respective countries. If you note, both are talking about the concept as a similar thing, right? Because I think talking about a separate living space for disenfranchised citizens of respective countries is something which is existing in both debates. What's the difference? One is a THBT motion, the other is a this house will motion. I think after the previous session, we all have a clarity about what the difference between motion types means. This house will is a policy motion, which means on side government, they not only have to say why what we are doing is a good thing, but they also have to explain how it's going to be done. The first motion, which is that this house believes that motion, does not require side government to present a policy or present a method in which they're going to go ahead and do this. They are going to argue why they should be done or why it ought to be done on a principle basis. So, as a judge, when you read that motion, you should be aware about what's the burden according to the motion type. Because if I, as a judge, I'm thinking that in the first example, Gov has to tell me how they're going to do it, then that's an unfair expectation I'm putting on them because it's not a this house will motion, as the expectation lies on a side government in a second sort of example in a this house will motion. So having a clear understanding of what different motion types look like has to be understood through like this example. That in the first example, they have to argue on a principle basis why it should be done or should not be done. But in the second motion, I think Gov has to present a policy in a way it will be done. And note, opposition also has an opportunity to provide a counter policy in the second motion, which they don't in the first type. So for this, I'm expecting all of you to have clarity on the different motion types which do exist. And as an ad, you have a similar burden to understand that this motion has separate demands according to the different motion type it does exist. It does cater to. One being a this house will, the other being a this house believes that. That's the other understanding. Lastly, is the binary within the debate. Uh, let's take the first example. This house prefers world A over B. It's extremely simple that one side has to say that we prefer the world A over the world B, and the side opposition has to defend world B over A. I think the binary is very clear. As an ad, I'm required to understand that listen, the gov has to defend thing A over thing B, and like the opposite thing for opposition. So it's extremely like important for you as an ad to know this binary in the sense that understand that one side has to defend world A over world B. If you have an expectation that gov has to probably tell me why world A is just inherently good, no, they have a specific burden to prove why it's better than the comparative, why it's better than the other side. Similar burden on opposition. So this sort of binary in a debate, okay, what do you have to prove over the other thing, is something which a judge needs to understand so that they can go and clearly judge the debate. The first example, I think, is very, very clear automatically of what each side has to defend, what the burden on each side looks like. The second is this house regrets glorification of democracy. So the idea within this is that a regrets motion largely is one which you have to go and say what the inherent problem with certain X thing is, that what's the glorification, like why do you go and regret this sort of glorification of democracy, what's the problem within that, and necessarily what is the counterfactual which will exist, in the sense that once you do go and regret something, what is the some sort of counterfactual which is going to come into when you go and regret this glorification of democracy, what is going to come forth within that. I think the larger thing to understand within the dichotomy and binary idea is that certain motions have it very clear within their binary of what each side has to defend. Certain motions don't have it little clear that you have to regret this thing over another thing. It's regretting glorification of democracy on a larger basis, not saying that this has to be defended over another thing. So I think as an edge in the second motion, I can't have an expectation that, oh, the other alternative apart from democracy will probably automatically have to come up and be a monarchy or be an autocracy, because that sort of binary is not given to me in the debate, which means further analysis of what that alternative could look like will exist within the debate itself. But in the first example, it's very clear that the side gov can't come and say, oh, we prefer world A over world C, because the binary that it has to be about world A versus world B. So that sort of binary is very clear within the debate. So these are three things that you talked about in terms of what is the prior clarity you need to have before the debate even starts. One is about the trade-off demanded by the motion. Second is about what the motion type looks like and what do I expect from both the teams. And thirdly is what is the binary set within the motion largely. Any doubts between these three things? This is just basic things which you as an edge need to know before the debate starts after you've looked at the motion largely. So the motion will be out. You have to now know what are the basic things within that. This is different from thinking, oh, what are government arguments and what are opposition arguments. That's not something you should think about. You have to necessarily see, oh, what is the trade-off? What does both sides have to present? And what is the motion type? What is the binary? These three basic questions. Any doubts within this? Cool. Seeing no doubts. Waiting for 5 more seconds. Perfect. You can go on to the next slide. Yep. Few things here as well. One, you have to check your biases that you do not get swayed by anything but content. I think we have repeated told you this.
getting swayed by things look like getting swayed by the demeanor, which means the way the people are speaking, whether they're speaking confidently, quote unquote, or not confidently according to you, the language proficiency they may have, the accent which they're speaking in, the reputational bias. Ke, oh, I have seen this speaker in 10 tournaments, hence they're automatically good. I don't want to listen to what they're saying. These are things you genuinely need to stay away from. This is the most important thing to be an objective adjudicator, because any biases you may have outside that room has to be kept away from the way you go and judge the content. You have to simply go ahead and judge the content being provided by the both the teams, and not any other preconceived biases you may have. Things like what sort of background they're from, this sort of accent is something which I prefer, or all these things. These sort of biases at all points of time have to be kept away from the objective way you're judging the debate, which has to be judged on the basis of what is the content which each side is providing, not what background or what demeanor which each side is giving to me. So you have to remain absolutely objective as an edge, even in these pages. Second is check for pragmatic biases. And this is something which is very, very common to happen. There are principled argumentation which exists in certain debates. Something I think we'll go in depth of what principles look like in some other session as well. But a lot of times, let's say there's an argument from opposition saying that here are three clear impacts. If you do this, X thing will happen, Y thing will happen, Z thing will happen. They give analysis to that, and they have a lot of things with it. They have a lot of things to say within that. Government side tells you that this is something which is principally should be done and extremely important, and they build up a whole principle around that. This is a principle of, let's say, reparation which needs to be upholded. Hence, any sort of impact which may accrue, uske disregard karke this does need to be done. As a judge, just because you see very practical impacts on one side does not mean you automatically credit them over the other side. कि हाँ यार, on this side I can see these three things happening and it's very clear, it's practical, so I'm going to give it to them. Principled arguments as well should be equally viable as pragmatic ones. So a side is trying to prove something to be principally correct or incorrect should be seen as equally important as the other side proving these are the three impacts after this happens. The nuance within this is this has to be treated equally until unless it's framed or proven otherwise within the debate. Some teams might prove to you why these are three impacts or pragmatic impacts which are more important than any principle. They can probably weigh it out to you. They can probably analyze that for you. So if that is the case, you do have to go and see how that necessarily goes and develops within the debate. But an inherent bias has to be kept away. कि मेरे को I only prefer pragmatic impacts. So अगर कोई मेरे को team pragmatic देगी, I'll make them win over the team who's giving me a principle. That should be kept away until unless it's proven within the debate logically why the impacts need to be given more importance than the principles. So until unless it's proven within the debate, any inherent biases of pragmatic impacts need to be kept away. And similarly for principles as well. It's not like, oh, you like principles, so you hear a principle and you don't hear any pragmatic impacts and you're like, oh, automatic win. So nothing like that should exist. Any sort of inherent impact or inherent bias of a pragmatic or a principle sort of biases need to be kept away. Thirdly, is upholding preconceived notions stemming from two things. One, personal opinions, but two, notion of ideal debates. So I think personal opinion is something which you largely discussed, that any sort of preconceived notions or of like personal opinion, oh, this is something which I individually disagree with, needs to be kept away. But secondly, uh, notion of ideal debates, because I think in certain instances, or in probably in general as well, in our head we have oh, you know what, this is how this debate should pan out, or these are the three arguments which sides should go ahead and say, or this is something which ob has to say in this debate. This is an expectation which is unfair to put on the teams, which is why I'm reiterating again, you have to judge the debate as it is happening in front of you logically on the basis of the content provided by both the teams, and not by any of the preconceived notions you may have. The last thing within this is, and this is just a further summary on this, don't expect a certain debate to happen, judge what is there. I think very self-explanatory. Don't have any notion that, you know what, aisa hoga to this side wins, otherwise they can't. You have to judge it on the basis of how it's happening, what is happening, and on the content being provided. Any doubts within these things as well? If not, you can just give me a quick thumbs up and we'll move on to the next one. Perfect. Great. Moving on to the next slide. Contradiction. So teams have a rule based obligation to stay consistent. The meaning of this is very simple, that if a team is going ahead and presenting a set of arguments, or let's say a direction which they're taking their arguments in, all three speakers, or all two speakers in the cases of British parliamentary debates, have to stay consistent with that. Consistent means very simple, that if you're starting off in a direction by framing certain arguments a particular way, your further analysis on those arguments should not go away from that. It has to be consistent through all three speeches and through any of the things you all the three speakers say or all the two speakers say. What is a contradiction? A contradiction is explicitly stating and taking a position opposite to the one previously made. Let's say the first speaker frames the world in a way which is supporting X thing, or let's say it's presenting a way where people believe in X thing. A second speaker can't come and say that, oh, people don't believe in X, but people believe in Y. So any sort of explicit stating away or going away from something which was established by you as a team is a contradiction. First speaker says that this is a red thing which you're talking about. Second speaker says this is a black thing, not a red thing. That's a clear contradiction or swaying away from the initial stance your team took within that debate. That's a contradiction. A contradiction, what is it not? It's not a statement that is clearly pre-argumentative or mistakenly said, even if analysis or identifying multiple ways in which an argument can pan out. So, and a couple of things here. I think certain things are said pre-argumentatively, which means they are said as an ancillary thing, not within an argument. So, for example, if there's an argument which you have to prove, ki, oh, this thing looks like this and not this, I think certain things are gone ahead and said ancillary as a mistaking basic. Acha yaar, speech mein, through the speech, somebody mentions that this thing is not read, but through the larger analysis which they're giving or the argument which they're trying to put forth, they are proving the thing to be read. So maybe a thing which was said, one sentence which was said as a mistake, is not necessarily a contradiction until unless it's firmly staying swaying away from the initial explicit thing which they set up in the debate. Let's say first speaker ने explicitly कोई चीज बोली है and second speaker अपने analysis के through explicitly उस चीज से drift away हो रहे हैं. That's a contradiction. The second thing is, a lot of times teams give even if analysis, and I've seen a lot of instances where even if analysis is seen to be a contradiction. Let's say as a team, I'm saying, we think this X thing is red, but if the other side is saying it's not, let's take that as well. So even if this thing is not red, we still win the debate because of the three following reasons. Is the team saying that this thing is earlier was red, but now it is not? No. What they're saying is we do believe it's red, but even if it's not, they're taking the best case of the other side or probably the worst case of their own side to compare both arguments. Even if in this instance, uh, it's not red, these are the three things which you're going to say. That is not a contradiction. That's an even if analysis. कि अगर even if X thing does happen or does not happen, our side is comparatively still better. This is an analysis which a lot of team gives to compare their arguments to the other side and comparatively come out as better arguments largely. That is not something which is necessarily seen as a contradiction. Lastly, identifying multiple ways in which an argument can play out. I think a lot of times it's not always कि, oh, ये चीज, this is how it's going to exactly pan out. Oftentimes teams give multiple ways that this is one way it may pan out, but here are three different other ways it can also play out. Let's say the first argument says that this is the way where each individual will get these sort of benefits, and in the second speech they remain true to the benefits they're providing, but they're saying these benefits can also sometimes be provided in these three other ways. This sort of identifying different ways in which an argument can play out does not mean it's a contradiction from the original one. It's just giving you multiple analysis or multiple methods to get to the same impact. That is not a contradiction. Thirdly, teams should only be credited for the first claim in an instance of contradiction. Judges may also consider the extent to which a contradiction has undermined the strength of the team's arguments. Two very simple things here. One, let's say first speaker says X thing, second speaker goes away from the X thing and says Y thing. As a judge, now you might be confused कि अच्छा मैं किसको credit करूं? It's a contradiction. I'm not sure what to credit. In this sort of clear contradiction, you ignore the second thing and you take into account the first thing only. So if I as a speaker, sometimes contradiction can exist even within my speech, right? It's not only a first speaker and second speaker, it can exist within a speech as well. If I am telling you thing X and I suddenly in my later part of the speech say X, nahi, Y, you have to ignore the second part of my thing where I'm telling you not this but this, and I have to stay true and or take into account the first thing. The second thing is you have to consider the extent to which a contradiction has undermined the strength of the argument. Let's say there's a lot of analysis to prove something to be an X thing, and then there's a subsequent lot of analysis to prove something to be a Y thing and not an X thing. That's a very heavy contradiction because there's a lot of analysis gone ahead to provide something to be one thing over the other. So you also have to keep into account what is the extent to which a thing has been contradicted. Is it a very minor contradiction where it's only one example which has been contradicted, or is the team contradicting the very idea of the argument? I think you've also learned what idea is, analysis is, example is, right? So certain times maybe the contradiction is only on one analysis, not the entire idea. So you have to go and see the contradiction in terms of how much is it. If it's contradicting the entire idea, then probably the strength of the argument has gone down substantially, and that's how you have to judge it. If it's only contradicting one analysis, not the entire idea, then probably some part of that argument still remains. This is the way the degree of the contradiction also has to be taken into account. Lastly, judges should not credit opposing teams unless they point out the contradiction. So, of course, I've already told you have to credit the first thing and not the second in case a contradiction has been made. But just because a contradiction has been made by this side does not mean I'll automatically credit the other side automatically. कि अच्छा इन टीम ने contradiction करी है तो the other side gets more speaker points or they win the debate. Until unless they point that contradiction out and then build their analysis on it. So this is the difference you have to take. You have to obviously the way an argument is panning out, you'll go and judge that, and you might now discredit the strength of the argument based on the contradiction independently, but does not automatically mean you'll now benefit the other side for it until unless they point that contradiction out. Right. Any doubts within this slide? What a contradiction means, what you have to do with it, largely, and all those things. Any doubts here? Second point is contradiction is not okay. Three things within that. One, it's pre-argumentative, mistakenly said. Oftentimes, a contradiction does not mean it's something which is ancillary said or it's said on a side note based as a mistake. कि, oh, this is a three analysis I'm proving or giving to prove an X thing, but my one sentence probably this is going opposite to that. That sort of a sentence as a mistake can't be seen as a contradiction. Second is even if analysis. Oftentimes, teams give analysis कि, अच्छा, even if this does not happen, we still win the debate because of these three other reasons. So if they're giving even if analysis, they're taking up now worst case to win over the other side's best case. That sort of even if analysis is not a contradiction, but just another way to prove why a team is better than the other side or comparatively better. The third is oftentimes arguments have multiple ways to pan out, which means I might say, okay, oh, this impact leads to X thing. But in my second speech, I'll also explain why there are three other impacts or other ways to achieve the X thing. This explanation of multiple ways for a thing to pan out does not mean I'm contradicting the first one. I'm just giving you additional ways it may pan out. These three things are not seen as contradictions. Any doubts within this now? If not, you can just give me a thumbs up. Cool. That's largely my part. Now Vrinda can take over.
Okay, great. Hello everyone, it's Vrinda this side. We'll continue with the presentation. Chirag, we can go to the next slide. Great. Okay, so Sehaj has gone ahead and covered what all you're supposed to do as an adjudicator before the debate starts in terms of removing your biases, knowing trade-offs, stuff like that. The reason why we have gone ahead and added the slide on contradictions before this slide is because I'll refer to what a contradiction, the role of a contradiction actually plays out in terms of note taking, etc. But yeah, that's the next step then. Once you are all ready to go in terms of things you're supposed to do before the debate actually happens, what exactly is the role of an adjudicator during the debate in and of itself is the first thing I'll go ahead and cover. So under that, the first thing you go ahead and do, this is simple and this is intuitive, which is you go ahead and make notes in the way the debate goes ahead and pans out. So there are multiple ways you can go ahead and make notes. There are two dominant ways are as follows. First is like a simple pen and paper. That's the one I've been using. That's the one I'll continue to use. Anyway, when it comes to my personal like preferences and stuff, I like using papers just more. I feel like it's more convenient for offline competitions, etc. in particular, because finding charging points, etc. in DU can be slightly like a bit of a hassle. A lot of the times like individuals end up using laptops as well. So if you think that your typing speed is faster than the speed at which you go ahead and write, or you think your notes are cleaner or more organized when you go ahead and cut like make your notes in the online mode through your laptop, probably using Google Doc or something, you can go forward with that as well. People do both of those things in and of itself. But yeah, a lot of people go ahead and use a mix of both things as well. So if there's an online competition, they go ahead and use their laptops to make notes, or if it's an offline competition, they use pen and paper. So the best way to find out is just to go ahead and practice. We have a slide on improvements and ways you can learn as well. But yeah, the best way you're going to go ahead and make notes is going to be based off of the way you're going to go ahead and practice note making in and of itself. So I'll just go ahead and elaborate probably the way I go ahead and make notes. So the first thing I do is that if this is my notebook, I probably go ahead and split one side of the page into two, so directly in two halves. I go ahead and write gov or argumentation on one side, opposition argumentation on the other side. At the top of my sheet, I basically go ahead and have PM hyphen LO, I mean PM, DPM, and like basically the speaker roles written, because I know I'm going to have to go ahead and give them speaker scores as well. We'll cover that later, what those are and stuff like that. But we'll have to give speaker scores to all of the speakers to denote the quality of their speeches, etc. Just in case I don't forget, I just have that written on top. I think lastly, it's also stuff like the way I go ahead and take notes is simple. So I have my large, expansive notes where I'm noting everything down right here. I also have an A4 size sheet right next to me. So I once the debate, like while the debate is going on, I also make really short notes in that sheet. So probably like one, two, three, like these are the three arguments I get from government, and one, two, three, four, these are the impacts of those arguments or particular impacts which stem from each arguments, etc. Basically, I maintain really short notes simultaneously, and that's the sort of note making that has worked out for me. Because if I have to go ahead and quickly reach a decision, which I'll cover like later, but if I have to reach a decision later, it becomes a little difficult and overwhelming to go through all of your notes in and of itself, especially in other formats like BPD debating, etc. But yeah, this can go ahead and help you all out even in the initial phase, because you all can go ahead and just have a quick little look at that overarching sheet. I mean, with the sheet which has all of the arguments written in a simpler form and in an overarching manner, where you don't probably have every single thing written down, and that can go ahead and basically help you determine the result in a quicker manner. Another thing you can go ahead and do is, while you're taking notes and there is a margin on your piece of paper, you can also go ahead and make arrows for things. So for instance, for arguments, I like to go ahead and do things like make a capital A for first argument, make a capital B for second argument. So these are just mental notes for me that okay, this is where the first argument starts. Once the first argument is done and I've made an A in the margin, I go ahead and make small little arrows right underneath to denote that these are the two or three impacts which are flowing from that argument. You can also go ahead and write I for impact right next to the impacts. You can write C for characterization when you're writing characterization down, or F for framing when you're writing framing down, stuff like that. So basically, the idea is simple. While you're note taking, you can go ahead and make these mental markers or mental blocks for yourself, which can just help you in terms of better identifying what exactly has come up so that you have better clarity. You can also go ahead and avoid repeating stuff. So a lot of times you'll see that whatever the speaker is speaking, for instance, DLO is saying something which LO has already covered. Save space and save repeated by repeating or writing the same matter again and again till the time there's new mech, etc. coming. Of course, write that. But if it's the same matter, you can avoid repeating it. It'll just go ahead and help you have better clarity in your note making, and it'll help you in your final OA as well. Lastly, a lot of the times in your OAs, this is something which Dhruv would cover, but you have to go ahead and give clash analysis. Clash is nothing except a point of contestation or something where there has been a lot of back and forth about in and of itself. For instance, X stakeholder being important. So there's a lot of back and forth about X stakeholder within the debate or whatever, right? So you can also go ahead and simultaneously make clashes as and when you go. So yeah, that brings me. So I'll just go ahead and talk about how you can go ahead and visualize those clashes. So in the additional sheet, A4 size sheet I was talking about, you can go ahead and make one big box, and you can just have the heading of the clash on top. You can split that box into two. So you have gov ideas within that clash on one side, op ideas within that clash on the other side. So these are just like visual aids I'm trying to basically go ahead and give you all, so that you all can go ahead and basically visualize what exactly can a clash analysis potentially look like. But yeah, okay, so the first is just in terms of note making. Second is judge the debate as it goes. So there are a couple of things on this. First, Even when speakers are going ahead and saying things, ask questions to yourself. So if they've gone ahead and tried to mechanize an impact, question yourself in terms of, is this mechanization or analysis sufficient to prove this? Is this even likely? Or go ahead and question, like continuously keep on questioning whatever they are going ahead and saying, because because your role as a judge is also to go ahead and make judgment calls within the debate. You're not just writing things down. So even if teams are going ahead and saying something, you should not buy it just at face value. You should look at it in and of itself in terms of questioning yourself that, for example, is this sufficient mechanization, or is they have they proven it to be likely, etc., in and of itself. So that's the idea in terms of keep on questioning yourself. Write down clashes as it goes. So don't leave clash analysis to the end of the debate, that the debate has been over and now you're doing it. It's better to do this simultaneously. So like I was saying, right, you have your expansive notes in your copy, but you, for instance, also can go ahead and have an additional piece of A4 size sheet right next to you, where you can simultaneously do clash analysis in and of itself. Then next, you basically have be open to inclining changes. This is important. Till DPM, if the debate has gone down, and I think Gov is winning for sure. But the debate massively changes in DLO in terms of the material responses and further fleshing out arguments, etc. So be quite open to the fact that till a particular speech you thought one side was winning, but post that speech another side is now winning. Or you thought this one clash is the most important, but after a speech teams have proven that no, this other clash is the most more important clash in and of itself. Stuff like that. So that's the whole idea. Be open to inclining changes in and of itself within this debate. A trajectory of a debate can be changed quite quickly. So be quite open to that and don't have a rigid mindset that no, I thought till DPM Gov is winning. So now I'm just gonna be in the headspace that Gov is winning. And that's the lens with which I go ahead and view the debate, because then you will have a very strong Gov bias. And of course, all of this applies to op too. So don't be in that sort of a headspace. This similarly applies to particular arguments. An argument could have been framed to be really important by PM, but till DLO, it's probably of very less importance. So be open to all of these inclining changes in and of itself. Okay, next is to note POI engagement. A lot of the times when teams ask POI, what judges usually do is in the margin they write POI and then they can go ahead and write the exact question which was asked. That's just an example in terms of various ways in which you can note down POI engagement. You can basically go ahead and write whatever has been asked and said within your notes, and this becomes important because this is direct form of engagement which can go ahead and help in creating a lot of clarity within the debate, the way the debate has panned out, etc. POI engagement also helps in close calls. So if the debate is really close and if you have to decide who wins the debate, a lot of the times POI engagements help in making that decision in and of itself. They also help in determining clashes and which clash goes to which team, etc. End conclusion is that POIs should be noted down. Usually a lot of judges completely ignore POIs and the answers to POIs in terms of noting those down or tracking. That's why I've added that so that you all can go ahead and remember or ensure that you're able to track those down. Next, we have make note of contradictions. So Sehaj basically explained what a contradiction is, right? This is where you can go ahead and note it down. Usually, if I'm taking notes, like using my blue pen, I just take a pencil and just highlight a contradiction. That okay, this is the second claim, i.e., the contradicting claim. If they've proven red in the top at or not top in the previous speaker has proven red, but now they are proving black, or which is contradictory or whatever, I know I cannot buy that claim. So just for the sake of clarity, I need to make a note that this is a contradiction in and of itself, that this is the matter which I necessarily cannot go ahead and credit because there is matter on top the first claim, and that is the one which has to stand. At that point in time, another thing you can do during the debate is make a note of contradictory claims, because you're not supposed to go ahead and buy those. Then once you're done doing all of these things and judging the debate as it goes, instead of just, so main conclusion of all of these points is simple: when a debate is going on, continuously also evaluate it as well. Don't just note things down, also simultaneously evaluate the debate. How do you do that is something which we'll cover in the next slide. But the idea is that don't think that your role is just to note things down while the debate goes. Your role is also to evaluate it as and when the debate takes place. Then you usually have 7 minutes to come up with your decision and your call, and 7 minutes to basically go ahead and explain or give justifications for that call, why, i.e., which team won and why. The idea is this, that usually what we would suggest to you all is that you take a minute or two once the debate has ended to decide your call in and of itself, because once you're done deciding with the call, you're going to have to spend more time on other stuff as well, which is why it's suggested that you try to come up with your call quickly. And a way you can go ahead and do that is, of course, by evaluating the debate as and when it goes, and not by waiting till the very end, that okay, once the debate is completely done, that's when I'll start the evaluation. So, yep, that's basically in terms of your role as an adjudicator during the debate. We can go to the next slide. Okay, holistic judging, which is how do you go ahead and evaluate debates? That's what we are basically going to go ahead and explain. Yep, 1 second. Okay, so the first thing to note is that there is no such thing as an automatic loss. If I'm government and Sehaj has gone PM, Dhruv has gone DPM, and I'm going Gov Whip, and in Gov Whip, I've contradicted whatever Sehaj is saying. Or for instance, I'm going whip and there's a lot of, or there's whip dump in my speech. Or for instance, in my whip speech, I didn't go ahead and respond or engage to arguments which come from opposition. Whip dump basically means that there is a completely new line of argumentation in my whip speech. I have done all of those things in my whip speech. That still does not mean that we go ahead and lose the debate on side government, which is to say, there is no such thing as an automatic loss. If a team has contradicted themselves, these are just examples, by the way. If, for example, if a team has contradicted themselves, or there's new matter in whip, or any of these things, that's just because these things happen does not mean that there is that a team automatically loses. So there's no grounds on which you can go ahead and say that this is an automatic loss, or you doing this thing or saying this thing is an automatic loss. There's no such thing as that. Second, which is how do you go ahead and evaluate debates? First thing you go ahead and do is you identify all clashes or points of contestation. These can be practical argumentations also, these can be principal argumentations also. The reason for that is this, that it becomes useful because it guarantees that you're able to justify any of the clashes if questioned, and not just those you're referring in your oral adjudication. What does this mean? You just have 7 minutes in your oral adjudication to explain the decision, which is why did government win over opposition or vice versa. Within that, it's highly improbable that you will be able to cover every single thing which was mentioned within this debate. Or if you have multiple clashes, you will be able to go ahead and explain all of those clashes in and of itself. But even if you have multiple clashes and you decide to explain all of those, it's highly likely that you will have to compromise on the quality of explanation, etc., in and of itself. Therefore, you need to go ahead and prioritize some clashes over the other. But after you are done with your explanation, teams can go ahead and ask you questions, and they're allowed to ask the judges questions on the basis of their justification, which they have gone ahead and provided for the decision. Within that, teams can probably go ahead and ask you questions related to some clashes which you haven't been able to, or which you haven't mentioned in and of itself within your oral adjudication. Therefore, it becomes important for you to go ahead and firstly identify all of the clashes which take place within a debate. So if I give you an example of a motion, right? So this house believes that India should sanction Russia. Here you can have multiple clashes. First could be teams arguing about the benefits or harms this sanction is going to go ahead and cause to the lives of Indians in and of itself. Second could be the benefits or harms this can probably go ahead and cause to the Ukrainians as an impact of Russia-Ukraine war, which is going on and taking place. And the need to basically, gov argumentation can rely upon is hinged on the idea that insofar as India sanctions Russia, this decreases Russia's capacity to go ahead and continue with their Ukraine invasion in and of itself. So then basically teams can go ahead and argue in terms of what is the impact of this on the lives of Ukrainian. Lastly, teams can of course argue other things as well. A third line of argumentation could probably be the impact of this on the life of Russians in and of itself in terms of Russian citizens, etc. These are all examples of different clashes within that debate. So the first job would just be to go ahead and identify all of these clashes. Second would be to consider the most important clashes or clash within the debate. There are a couple of ways you can go ahead and do that, and these are all written in a particular order. So If you have identified multiple clashes, you also need to go ahead and know which clash is the most important so that you can prioritize that clash within your oral adjudication. Or if there are two important clashes, how do you go ahead and identify those two important clashes so that you can go ahead and basically explain those within your oral adjudication? There are a couple of steps which judges have to go ahead and follow. First is that, is there one criteria or principle that all teams explicitly agree is true and important? So in the debate, this house believes that India should sanction Russia if teams explicitly say that the thing we care the most about are the lives of Ukrainians in and of itself, and they go ahead and explain why that's probably the case, because they are the most vulnerable, how they have been caused a lot of harm, etc. Therefore, they are the ones who are most deserving of protection, and they are the ones who need to be prioritized within this debate. If both teams, Gov and Op, explicitly agree on this, then that is the metric with which you have to judge the debate. I.e., that is the clash you have to go ahead and prioritize within your oral adjudication, simply because teams have gone ahead and explicitly agreed for it to be the most important criteria or clash within that debate. Then, if that has not happened, only then you resort to step number two, which is this: is there one criteria or principle that all teams implicitly agree to be true and important? So, note the first one was they explicitly agree, here they implicitly agree. So, this could probably go ahead and look like teams don't explicitly say this out loud, but their argumentation, the ideas which they are trying to run, the impacts they are trying to draw, they are all related to the lives of Ukrainian individuals in and of itself. At that point in time, the implicit criteria which both Gov and Op have gone ahead and agreed to judge this debate looks like the lives of the Ukrainians in and of itself. So that's the second metric with which you have to judge. In case first metric is something which does not take place within that debate, then you have to go ahead and take into consideration if there is implicit agreement between teams of one criteria or clash being of importance and true in and of itself. Third, if this doesn't happen, i.e., there is no explicit agreement between Gov and Op in terms of what is important, then you resort to second criteria. You see, oh, there is also no implicit agreement in terms of teams going ahead and agreeing with what is true and what is important as a criteria. What do you do then? If not, then is there one criteria or principle that one team in the round has successfully proven to be true and important? I.e., if no team agrees on one criteria and all teams are asserting different metrics, which team has provided the best reason to believe that their metric is the most important one in the round? Which is to say, in this motion, this I'm repeating it again so that everyone can keep track. This house believes that India should sanction Russia. If argumentation on Gov is this, that Ukrainians are the ones that if the argumentation on op is that you should go or on Gov is that you should go ahead and care about the lives of individuals who go ahead and 1 second, my battery is really low. I need to connect it. 1 second. Okay, 1 second. Okay, perfect. So if one side argues that the reason why India should sanction Russia is because this is going to decrease the capacity of Russians to continue with their invasion or war which is taking place in Ukraine, and that's why basically you should go ahead and care about Ukrainians. Opposition goes ahead and argues that no, you need to go ahead and care about the lives of Indians, because insofar as India goes ahead and sanctions Russia, they probably have to go ahead and they cannot go ahead and get a lot of oil from Russia. How this oil usually is really cheap. So if even if they have to go ahead and get oil, it probably has to be from other countries where they're gonna go ahead and get it for expensive prices. Or they basically can go ahead and also argue that at a domestic level, renewable energy or renewable sources, etc., of going ahead and getting this energy are not necessarily sufficient. Therefore, India is reliant on this oil for it to be, because it's cheap and it's something which they necessarily need, because a lot of their industries, etc., are also largely dependent on oil at that point, like electricity energy, etc. Therefore, Indians should be the ones we should care the most about, because they are really vulnerable, and therefore you should not go ahead and sanction Russia. These are two different metrics which both the teams have gone ahead and established. At that point in time, you need to compare competing analysis. For instance, if Gov just posits that, oh, we should care about Ukrainians without explaining why you should care about Ukrainians over Indians, but over the lives of Indian individuals, whereas op goes ahead and explains the opposite of that, in the sense why you should go ahead and care about Indians over Ukrainians. At that point in time, the metric that you should go ahead and evaluate this debate is the one where the lives of Indians is the one, like the important criteria becomes the lives of Indian individuals in and of itself. That's what we mean by, if there is disagreement, then which team has gone ahead and proven their metric to be the most true and important within that round in and of itself. Lastly, if none of this happens, i.e., first, there's no explicit agreement, then you go to the second step where there is also no implicit agreement for criteria. Third, no team has also gone ahead and explained why one criteria should be prioritized over the other. At that point in time, if none of these apply, judges judge based on what ordinary intelligent voter would take to be important. What Sehaj has already gone ahead and explained. This should be the last resort measure only, as it is very rare that none of the aforementioned scenarios would apply. Which basically means that what do you think is the most important as the judge? This criteria should be applied at the very end. The reason why I've explained this in detail is simple, because I've seen a lot of judges directly apply this criteria. What I think is the most important within this debate is this, and that's how I've judged it. But that's literally the last resort, and that's supposed to be done when all three of these criterias don't go ahead and apply. That's why I've gone ahead and explained this. So that's basically how you're able to, after identifying all clashes, how are you able to go ahead and establish which one is the one you should use to judge this debate upon, or if there are two clashes or three clashes, etc., which ones are you like, if the two clashes you have to prioritize, what do those two clashes look like, etc., and of itself you can determine those things by these, by going ahead and using this priority list in and of itself. Note that this also can apply for two criteria. If teams go ahead and explicitly agree that both of these things are true and equally important, etc., if it's an actor's motion and teams agree that both of these needs of the actors are true and equally important, then you can go ahead and base it off this entire one, two, three, four thingy for those two criteria as well. But this was just to go ahead and help you out in terms of how do you identify the clashes you probably need to go ahead and prioritize in your OA, insofar as you are likely to also have multiple clashes in a debate. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Okay, number of clashes. A lot of the times, judges go ahead and feel that they haven't judged properly, etc., simply because there's only one clash which they're able to identify, or only one clash which is actually there in the debate. The idea is simple, it's completely fine for a debate to just have one clash. And even sometimes, teams can explicitly agree that this is the most important thing, or this is the only clash you should, or only metric with which you should judge this debate upon, etc. It's perfectly normal, but the point I'm trying to get to is this, that teams which win the most number of clashes doesn't automatically mean they win. So there's no such thing as numeracy of clashes being one equals win. What do I mean by that? So if there are three clashes within the debate I mentioned, in terms of impact on Russians, impact on Indians, as well as impact on Ukrainians, but teams explicitly agree that the impact of Ukrainians is the most important and should be the most important metric to judge this debate. And that clash lands on side government, but opposition wins the other two clashes in terms of lives of Indians as well as Russians. At that point in time, the debate still has to go to side government, insofar as the most important metric is something which gov team has gone ahead and won. So in short, even if opposition has won lot of clashes in number, but the most important one, for instance, is won by government, the debate still has to go to government. Basically, number of clashes, a team winning x number of clashes should not be the metric for you to go ahead and award that team a win. Okay, what are the various questions you can go ahead and ask yourself? Before that, I'll have a sip of water, take up questions, and then I'll proceed. Okay, great. What are a couple of questions you can go ahead and ask yourself while you are judging? First is framing. Where is the debate happening? Do both teams agree with it? If not, did any team give reasons why their frame is more likely? What do we mean by this? A lot of the times, teams go ahead and give framing for particular debates in and of itself. For instance, the way they go ahead, they could frame that this debate is more likely in developing countries in and of itself, or this debate is more likely to pan out either in developed countries, etc. So where is the debate happening is something you should go ahead and question yourself in terms of what is the stakeholder which teams have framed to be the most important in terms of the impacts being to that particular stakeholder, etc. Once you know where is the debate happening, etc., the second question you ask is, do both the teams agree with it? If they do, well and good. If they don't, then have teams given any reasons why their frame is more likely? So for instance, one side says that this debate is likely to happen in developing countries, the other says it's likely to happen or have more impact in developed countries. At that point in time, you have two contradictory claims. Then you need to assess which one is more likely on the basis of the material which has come within this debate. This could look like analysis to go ahead and prove that this happens in developing countries because of one, two, three reasons, and you need to go ahead and analyze whether these reasons are persuasive enough for you to buy or not in comparison to the claim that this happens in developed countries, etc., in and of itself. So that's the first question you can go ahead and ask yourself. Second is C for proven things or crediting assertions. Okay, what do we mean by this? So, judges are entitled to assess how well substantiated an argument is and should actively go ahead and do so. What do we mean by this? If a team is trying to go ahead and claim impacts like we'll do this, and stop war, or we are going to go ahead and eradicate discrimination, or we'll stop racism. These are relatively really large claims to go ahead and make, but if they have really little analysis to go ahead and like make these claims seem plausible or likely, at that point in time the things you need to go ahead and question is whether something has been proven or whether this is just an assertive line which the teams have gone ahead and made. Or secondarily, even if they have gone ahead and given you some sort of analysis, is it sufficient for you to go ahead and buy that claim in and of itself? It could be possible that there are a lot of links which are missing, and you have found those out as the judge, that they probably just explain A, but for this impact to happen, they also needed to explain B, C, and D. For instance, for an impact to go ahead and happen, teams have gone ahead and explained the incentive for countries to do something, but they haven't gone ahead and explained whether these countries have the capacity to do something in and of itself. So these are basically things you can go ahead and use to question whether things are proven or not in and of itself. Next, you have exclusivity. This basically means that is the harm they are pointing out only on government, or did the opposition give sufficient reasons to prove that this harm doesn't exist on their side too? What do we mean by this? For instance, opposition says that a harm is happening on the side of government, but have they gone ahead and proven why that same harm doesn't happen on their side? Because as a judge, you can go ahead and question exclusivity of impact, which basically means for it to be credited as a unique harm on government, they need to go ahead and also prove why that harm doesn't necessarily happen on side opposition too. So that's simply when it comes to exclusivity of impact and whether or not they have proven whether the harm or benefit is exclusive to their side or not. Next, you have comparative, which is do not consider how important you think a particular argument is in abstract, rather how important it is in that particular debate. What do we mean by this? So, if I take the example of something which was mentioned before, which is this house prefers world A over world B, the reason why you go ahead and prefer world A, you go ahead and give certain benefits on side government. But that's not sufficient. You need to be comparative. So you need to compare the benefits of world A in comparison to benefit of world B, and then go ahead and deduce which side has more benefits and why, and therefore that's the world you're going to go ahead and prefer in and of itself. So don't look at benefits in isolation, that oh, this is the gov benefit which they have gone ahead and provided and it's good. You're supposed to go ahead and look at benefits and harms in comparison to each other, and then decide which side has more harm and which side has more benefit within a particular clash in and of itself. Next is weighing, which is both of the sides are likely at the end of the debate to go ahead and have proven some sort of benefit in and of itself. At that point in time, have sides gone ahead and proven why their benefit is more important than the benefit which takes place on the other side? Or has government if government has won one clash, opposition has won one clash, what's more important and why? Let's talk about this. First is in terms of clashes. Note that clashes have to be weighed as well. But what do I mean by weighing? Weighing simply means that proving the importance of something, or why should you as a judge care about something in and of itself. So if there are two clashes within that debate, in terms of, for instance, one clashes impact on Russians, one clashes in terms of impact on Ukrainians, at that point in time, you need to go ahead and weigh, and you need to decide which clash is more important than the other. So that's something which you need to go ahead and weigh out and question yourself. If teams have done so well and good, this brings me to the metric explanation which I have just covered. But yeah, second thing to go ahead and do is you need to go ahead and weigh claims as well. You need to explain that if there is benefit A existing on government and benefit B existing on opposition, why is benefit A more important or should be weighed more over benefit B, and the vice versa also applies depending on what you buy. So that's another thing which you as judges need to go ahead and do. We can go to the next slide. Chirag, are you here? We can probably go to the next slide. Okay, perfect, great. Another thing which you need to go ahead and question are responses. Two things on this. First, here, arguments that are unresponded to should still be treated as impactful and weighed as such, i.e., boxed out arguments, however, should not be accepted on the face value as true and important, i.e., the level of their substantiation should still be scrutinized. So, for instance, side government has one argument and opposition has not responded or engaged to that argument at all. That's a boxed out argument at that point in time. But that just because it's a boxed out argument does not mean that you as a judge completely discredit it. Of course, you should go ahead and still consider it in your evaluation. It should be treated as impactful and it should be weighed as such as well. But that does not mean that just because government, so a lot of teams end up saying that if I'm opposition and if I'm government and I have an argument, a lot of the teams end up saying that opposition has not engaged with this, which is why this stands or this argument stands. That's unfair or that's untrue, because you as judges can also go ahead and question that argument in and of itself, which is to say it should not be accepted on face value as true and important. You should still go ahead and scrutinize the level of substantiation that has been there, i.e., has there been sufficient analysis or mechanization to prove it to be likely, or does it even stand on my sheets, etc. in of itself? All of these are questions which you need to go ahead and you need to go ahead and ask for arguments which are unresponded to in and of itself. Second, on responses, a lot of the times teams give responses but they are really short or one liner responses. So then you need to question, what did this one liner response even do? I'm not saying it's bad. A lot of the times one liner responses can be impactful as well, but you need to assess what did it do. Was this a response which is mitigatory in nature? To what degree? Does it take it down? Even if response, are they able to flip it, or is it just an unnecessary attempt? What do we mean by these things? A lot of the times, if there is an argument A which exists on government, opposition can go ahead and respond to that argument. But what is the impact of that response in and of itself? So if argument A is able to prove this amount of benefit, the response on op probably decreases the benefit from here to here, but it doesn't completely take it down. That's one example of what a mitigatory response looks like. So you can go ahead and assess to what degree is it able to go ahead and take it down. Is it able to go ahead and completely take down the argument fully or not? Is it an even if response, which is even if what the government is saying is true, why do we still go ahead and probably win this clash, etc.? Or are they able to go ahead and flip the argument, i.e., whatever they were going ahead and trying to prove, are you able to go ahead and flip that through your responses, or is that an unsuccessful attempt at flipping that argument, etc. in of itself? So what is the impact of these responses is something which teams have to go ahead and judges have to go ahead and assess by evaluating what did this response even do in and of itself. Next up, we have assessing rule violation. So, judges should remove the advantage of this violation in and of itself. Examples include completely ignoring contradictory material or new arguments from whip speeches, etc. Next is just to go ahead and check for speaker role fulfillment, in the sense, have each of the speakers gone ahead and fulfilled their particular speaker roles, i.e., what they were supposed to do. Lastly, while evaluating, do not complete links of analysis for either side or speakers. This basically means that if there's A, B, and C things needed to prove X impact, but the team has not gone ahead and done that, they have just directly said the X impact. You, as the judge, are not supposed to go ahead and complete links of analysis just because you know information about the issue or just because you can go ahead and think of it, etc. You, as the judge, are not supposed to go ahead and do that. So, yep, we can go to the next slide. One second. Okay, yeah, we are on speaker scores. We'll wait for a couple of seconds, take up questions, and then Dhruv can take over. Which call, Sukriti?
Uh, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay.
Not audible.
Yeah, it is written that you should usually. I'm talking about the call that was there, that within 1 or 2 minutes you're supposed to make the call. What exactly that is, like
Oh,
context?
call basically means the decision. Which side has won? Has government won or has
Okay,
opposition won? That's it.
got it.
No worries, no worries. Okay, Dhruv, you can continue and take over.
Thank you, Vrinda. Can we go on to the next slide? Next one, and the next one. Yeah, so like we'll start with speaker scores now. Speaker scores essentially represent the speaks that you're giving to one particular debater. So a speaks of a debater, even within the team who's winning, can vary from other debaters as well. So for example, if you think that the prime minister deserves more score, even though the whole complete team is winning, you might still be inclined to give them different speaks depending on their role fulfillment or the amount of clarity or the arguments that they were able to bring within their own specific like speeches in the first place. So I'll just start with like the general things here, then we can like go to the speaker score range as well and discuss that as well. All right, so what is margin of victory? Margin of victory essentially represents the difference that is existing within like the two teams, so the team which is winning and the team which is losing. So margin of victory determines the amount of like difference that exists between the winning team and the losing team. So it can occur in like two ways. Number one, numerical essentially means the quantitative difference that is existing when you like sum up all the speaker scores of the team which is winning, and you like differentiate between that with the speaker scores of the team which is losing. So there are like two ways to look at margin of victory. One is like numerical, where you like combine all the speaker scores and you subtract the speaker scores of the losing team, and one is notional. So I'll just like state the margin of victory यहाँ पे जो लिखे हैं. So essentially when like the margin is between 0 to 2/2.5, we consider that debate to be close, because obviously like the margin is still very very less and not that much. It becomes close to clear when you start moving from 2.5 to 4. Then it becomes clearer when it's from 4 to 8. So 4 to 8 essentially represents that there was a substantial difference between like the two teams and it was a clear debate. It wasn't a close debate for you to adjudicate as well. Thrashing is like, this rarely happens. It's like a difference which is more than 8. So like substantial difference that is existing within teams, and like that is something that's thrashing. So what is the difference between numerical and notional? I've already talked about numerical. Notional represents the what you thought within your own perception of the debate, right? So obviously, like when you're referring to the speaker scale, and speaker score range, you have to be quantitative in nature because you're objectively judging whether the speech was good, whether the speaker was good, and you have to adhere to a scale. But notionally is what your perception of the debate was. Obviously, it cannot be substantially different from like what the numerical range was. So for example, if the numerical range you are saying is 6, but for you the debate was very close, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense.
So it can be it can be a bit varied because you have to adhere to the techniques and the standardizations of the speaker scores when you're like giving them, but notionally can be a bit different. So for example, your numerical range could be 3 or could be 4, which is like close to clear, but you still thought the debate was relatively close as well. So there can be some differences between the notional sense and like the numerical sense as well. So in the, for example, like even though for you the range was notionally very very close, the margin was still 2. Even though the margin doesn't state that it was very close for you, but given that when you were actually providing the scores for those speakers, that is when like there was a little bit more margin than what your notional degree of that score was. So what are speaker scores? I've already cleared that. Yeah, so number one thing that is important is you have to start at an average value, right? Obviously, like if a debater was very good, you won't just give them the lowest scores that are available. So you have to start at an average value, which is like 75. So we will be operating within the scale of 67 to 83, and you have to start with 75. If you think the speaker is, if you think the speaker is particularly adhering to a particular like scale, then you move up. If the speaker is not, and like if the speaker is not able to fulfill their role, if the speaker is not able to prove their arguments, if the impacts are unclear, if the speeches are unclear, if the arguments are very unclear, if there is no role fulfillment, for example they are whip but they're not weighing anything, then you can start moving down as well. So this is where you have to start with the average, but obviously like you'll move up or down according to the actual speech that is also happening. Secondarily, you should always use the full scale as well. Obviously, like getting an 81, an 82, and 83 are pretty rare, or simultaneously 67, 68, 69. Giving them to speakers is pretty rare, but that still doesn't mean that you shouldn't apply the whole like range of speaker scores that are available to you. So for example, when you're in a very, very good debate, it's not unfair for you to give teams even 79, even 80, even 78. Or if you're in a particularly bad like room in terms of quality of debates that are happening, it's particularly fine for you to give them 73, 74, 72 as well. So it all depends on how the debate went and how the speaker score needs to function within that. We can like move on to the speaker score range. You can go back. Yeah, एक और side पे है. All right. So I'll just like start with the average range. Yeah, I'll just start with the average range because this is where most of the debates happen, which is 74 to 76. So arguments are almost exclusively relevant and frequently persuasive. Occasionally, but not very often, the speaker may slip into deficits in explanation, simplistic arguments, vulnerable to competent responses, etc. So this essentially like represents the average speech. The average speech has to talk about relevant stuff. The average speech has to be persuasive. But obviously, the arguments that are coming in the average speech cannot be proven to the most maximum of the degrees. Obviously, there are lines of arguments or like links that are probably missing in that speech, but the speech is mostly relevant and it's mostly clear, even though like it's not foolproof. Like the arguments that the debater is making is not foolproof and it's susceptible to responses very, very clearly. This is like what an average speech represents. So the speaker holds one's attention, provides clear structure, and successfully fulfills their basic role of the table on the table. Yeah. So this essentially represents that an average speaker, when you're giving them a 74 to a 76, they have some clarity in their speech. Their speech is persuasive to a degree, which is to say, it's not that they're coming up and they're completely talking about irrelevant stuff. They're like oftentimes very, very relevant, and what they're talking about is also impactful within this debate. But also, the arguments that they're talking about probably haven't been proven to the best of the degree. There are deficits that are existing within explanations. Probably a good team can probably respond to that argument because it's not proven to the maximist of the degrees as well. So whenever you're like judging, 74 to 76 is in general the range that generally happens. Obviously, you move up and down given how the debate is going to pan out. I'll also read out the 77 to the 77 or 78 range. Relevant and pertinent arguments address key issues in the round with sufficient explanation. The speech is clear in almost its entirety and holds one's attention persuasively. Role is well fulfilled and structure is unlikely to be problematic. So when you move on to the 77, 78s, obviously the argument isn't perfect, right? But it's still more proven than what it was in 74 to the 76 range. Probably there are more reasons and more like lines of analysis that the speaker has given. Probably this like role fulfillment is done better when you're providing to 77 to 78. So for example, if the speaker is a whip, probably they have used weighing metrics and they have like compared the debate in a holistic and like they have summarized the debate in a thematic manner. If you're like the first speaker, probably you have laid characterizations like very, very well. You are clear in what you are laying out and you have like substantially mentioned the arguments that you were going to talk about. So obviously 77 to 78 isn't perfect, but it's better because it's not very simplistic. It has some layers of analysis, which is obviously not perfect. So don't think that 77, 78, 79 are unachievable scores. So even when you are judging, these scores are pretty achievable, but it depends on the contents of the speech of that debater. So whenever you're looking at the scale, just don't think that one score is very, very unachievable, that you just cannot grant it. Obviously, like just in terms of quantities, most debates happen between 73 and 77. But if a speaker is very good, you can give the speaker 78, you can give the speaker 79, you can give the speaker 80, and simultaneously lower scores as well. When you start moving above the 78 like speeches towards 79, towards 80, what is generally like done within these speeches is that these speeches are very, very holistic. So what these speeches take in mind often into account is preemptive stuff that they're talking about, right? Which is to say, whenever you're making an argument, that argument is so holistic that the other side has to be sophisticated when they're responding to that argument. So just a basic one-liner or a two-liner response isn't enough to probably take out your argument when you're debating on the ranges of 79 to 80 or like 78, etc., right? So this is where more lines of responses are required. This is where you have given more reasons for your arguments. This is where your arguments are more clear in general, and they require decent responses and rebuttals and times for the other side to be taken into account. So this is where you are like moving into the 79, 80 range. You can like read the specifics of that range. Obviously we'll send the PPT later, but like this is in general what it looks like. We can go on to the next slide. Yeah, I'll also just read out the 72, 73 wala. Uske niche you can read by yourself as well. No, go back one. Yeah, so the 72 and 73 arguments are generally relevant and some explanation of them is given, but there may be obvious gaps in logic, multiple points or irrelevant material, and simplistic argumentation. The speaker holds the like attention, but is very, very uncompelling and irrelevant as well to a degree. There is a decent but incomplete attempt to fulfill one's role, and structure may be imperfectly delivered. So when you are moving towards the 72 and the 73 mark, this is where like the arguments that are being made are not that compelling. This is where the relevance of the arguments comes into question. This is where probably there are massive like gaps within what the speaker is talking about. So for example, whenever the speaker is making an argument, the speaker takes massive logical leaps and like just jumps without completing those links to a larger degree. So when you're moving towards the 72 or 73 mark, obviously the speaker is still attempting, still trying to be clear, but there are massive gaps in logic. There are gaps, and the speaker is a lot of times irrelevant, which is to say they're talking about an argument, but they never prove why that argument is applicable within the debate itself. So this is where you move towards like the lower end of the 72, 73, 74 marker as well. Obviously, like you can go lower, which is like 67, 68, 69. 70, 71. But these scores are generally which you don't see occurring a lot, because obviously whenever you're judging a debate, the speaker still tries to do something, tries to be clear to a degree, tries to be persuasive to a degree. So what happens generally in tournaments and what you'll see like throughout is that like 72 and 73 are generally like in most circumstances the lowest that you generally go, and 80, 81s are something that you see rarely, but you also see them to a degree. If you have to go below that, then there have to be significant problems within the speeches. For example, if you're talking about 67, 68, 69, the speaker probably didn't complete their time. The speaker probably just didn't, like, I'll just read the 67 as well. No structure or fulfillment, or the speaker did not speak at all. So notice how 67 is like the speaker just didn't speak at all. So this is not a score that you generally give to an average speech. So you have to be very, very careful as an Aj when you're like giving scores. For example, if the speech is average, you don't just go ahead and give them a 71 or a 70. If the speech is average, you don't just go ahead and give them an 80. So you have to be very particular and careful in what you are giving them as scores. Obviously, like if there are massive gaps, massive like leaks within their arguments, that still doesn't justify them a 67. That probably justifies them a 72, 73 at lowest, or 71. But that doesn't mean that you go ahead and like just randomly give them a 67, because they've still like tried, they've still attempted something, they've still tried to be persuasive to a degree. And like that is how like you have to be very, very careful when you're giving scores in general. Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, next one. All right, structure of an OA. Any questions till now? I'll just wait 30 seconds. Understood. Okay, thank you, Bobali. And then A67 would look, a 67 would look like a person introducing themselves and then saying thank you. I mean, yeah, to be fair. So just don't go ahead and like randomly hand out 67s to people. Be charitable. If they're trying, if they're giving a speech, if there aren't massive problems with their speech, give them a 74, give them a 75. If there are problems, give them a 73. If they're still good but not very good, give them a 76. So be very, very careful when you're using the scale. And probably like if a person just introduces themselves and then says thank you, you can still give them a 78. So it's like 67 is like the barest of the barest and the minimum of the minimum. You probably will like never need to give the score to anyone, most probably, hopefully. Yeah. I think we can also take like a 1 minute break also, because I think like Vrinda took coffee time and coffee session, and Sehaj also like did very in depth. So I just don't want ki attention lose ho rahi hai logo ki. So I'll just wait for 1 minute. You can like just get water, get some food if you want. We'll start in 1 minute, 1 minute 30 seconds. All right. Hopefully everyone is back and present. We are at 20 people abhi. Yeah, I think let's start. All right. So we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so like structure of an OA like essentially represents how you are going to communicate your feedback and your reasoning to the team, right? Which is to say, what we had discussed beforehand was how you come like in decision, or like how you come towards a verdict, how you justify a verdict. But essentially, like this is where your communication with the teams happen. And for example, for the so the time that you get for an oral adjudication in like general in most tournaments is 7 minutes and like a grace time of 15 to 20 seconds. So like this is the time that you get to convey your reasoning of why you gave it to one side over the other. This essentially becomes the most important thing, because this is the basis on which the judges then mark you, the teams then mark you. So for example, if you're like OA, which is your oral adjudication, isn't very in depth, it's very unclear, so the teams are probably not satisfied. They'll probably mark you low and you won't break as an adjudicator, which is to say you won't get to judge semis, quarters, or finals. So this is like a very important thing, because it determines how teams are going to score you, how willing they are going to score you. So you have to be very, very clear in terms of what you are trying to convey through your oral adjudication, and how you are convincing the teams that what you are saying is even right and even relevant within the debate. So a general structure that you can follow, and I also follow, is obviously start with the verdict, right? Obviously, you don't want to make the teams wait for like the entire duration of the oral adjudication and then just announce the verdict at the end, that probably pisses off the teams even more. So the first thing that the teams expect and that you should do as a judge is whenever you're communicating your justification and verdict, start with the start with the verdict. So this becomes the most important thing because this is what the teams are looking out for very very crucially, right? So you have to convey the verdict at the start and don't like try to like wait for the like verdict. I'll just do it at the end, I'll just do it in the middle. You have to be very very clear and very very concise in how you are using up your time, because time that you have is also very very like limited. Secondly, you can also talk about the margin of victory, which is to say you thought the debate was relatively close, you thought the debate was close to clear, or the debate was very clear as well. Obviously, like when you're trying to get scores and like when you're trying to convince teams, if the debate was thrashing or very very clear, probably don't try to mention that within the margin of victory. Just try to mention the verdict and just try to go on to like the next like segment within your oral adjudication. So these are some of the things that you can keep in mind. Obviously you don't have to lie within your oral adjudication. So if a debate was clear, don't just go ahead and say that the debate was very close just so you can get some marks from the teams, because probably like that is something that's obviously number one unethical, but the teams can probably realize that the debate wasn't close in terms of how you are like justifying that verdict. So even if you say at the start the debate was very close and then you just give all the clashes to the other team, the teams probably know you were like not being honest with them and they're probably going to deduct the marks from you. So the number one thing that is important is announce the verdict at the start, and you can also announce the margin of victory if you thought it was close or very close or close to clear. Don't do that if it's thrashing, because that's probably not something that teams are going to like, and that's not something that you need to announce explicitly that the debate was thrashing. So that's not something that's required from you. What is the second thing that you can do? After just announcing the verdict, which is like one team won over the other, what was the margin of victory? You have already talked about it. The second thing that you can also do is incorporate general comments within your OA. So these are like just general thoughts that you have about a debate. For example, you can comment on the quality of the debate. Were the burdens fulfilled? Give, for example, if this was an actor motion, did both the sides understood that what this motion was about? Were they able to fulfill their like burden? Were they able to talk specifically from the perspective of the actor? So you can also like talk about these things from a general sense. But another thing that is important is just don't force a general comment, right? General comments are meant to be relevant and they're meant to be like from your perspective of what you think is important and you want to convey to these teams. So just don't force a general comment just for the sake of it. If you actually have a thought on a broader level about the debate that you want to talk about, for example, you want to mention that the burden was well fulfilled, the burden wasn't well fulfilled, if you want to mention that the quality of the debate was good, if you want to mention that the characterizations in this debate were relevant, or like exclusive arguments were made or weren't made, that's something that you can probably do. But just don't force it for the sake of it. That's something which is important. Obviously, if you don't have a general comment, you can directly move on to the next segment of your oral adjudication, which is like clash analysis and just the reasoning in general to begin with. So now we'll move on to like the third segment within your like structure, which is important. Obviously, first you'll announce the verdict, you'll give the margin of victory, then you'll move on to the general comments if you have any. If you don't, just move on. Thirdly, we'll move on to the clashes. Clashes is essentially about what the debate was about, how the debate went, which are the most important themes within this debate. Another strategic thing to note here is like, given that the time that you have is very very limited, don't talk about unnecessary arguments or irrelevant clashes to the most extent, right? Which is to say, if you thought one clash was the most important, that's where significant amount of your time needs to go to justify why that one particular clash was won by one particular side. Obviously, another thing to note here is you have to prove and you have to like justify why that was the most important clash, right? So just don't go ahead and like start saying ki this was won by one team, this was won by the other team. If when you're like judging the debate, you think one particular thing is the most important, you have to prove and like tell the teams why it is the most important thing. And I think this is something that Sehaj and Vrinda have also talked about. So like this is something, for example, how do you decide which is the most important clash? Number one, the first thing that you notice is there a criteria that the teams agree upon? So if teams agree upon a particular clash and that is the most contested and that is where the most time is spent, that becomes the most important clash because that is the criteria both teams agree upon explicitly and are rebutting and like engaging in within this debate. So then that becomes your most important clash within this debate. Secondly, it can also be implicit agreement, which is to say they agree on a criteria, they are spending most of their times on a criteria, but they haven't explicitly like stated that this criteria is the most important, which is implicit. That's also something Vrinda has talked about. Thirdly, it's also about if different teams have different metrics of winning, which team justifies its metrics better. So for example, in terms of clashes, I'm winning on one metric, the other team is winning on one metric. Are the teams able to give you a reason for their metric to be more important? So this becomes the third thing, like in terms of hierarchy at what you look. And fourth, which is very, very unlikely, is you just randomly, like, is you as an average reasonable voter deciding which is the most important clash in terms of what you think was important. This is something that generally never happens because there is at least something or a criteria that all teams mostly agree upon in general. So why is this like clash wali cheez very, very important for you to like talk about? Number one, I think the first thing that you have to justify is why is this clash the most important? So for example, if you have multiple clashes, if you have 2 or 3 clashes, but you want to spend most time on one clash because you thought that was the most important, just justify to the teams why that was the most important thing and why that is the thing you're going to spend most amount of your time on. Because if the teams don't know why this is the most important thing, they won't buy your justification, they won't buy your feedback. Secondly, after you have justified why this clash is the most important, and when you're explaining within the clash, try to mention what is the particular line of argument you're talking about. Obviously, you like give in a particular clash, you don't have to state everything that the teams have stated. You cannot like just come here and state the argument and just state all the analysis that the teams have provided on both sides, but the teams should still know which argument you are talking about. So you can probably like mention the argument that the team has said. You can give few lines of analysis as to what this team has stated and quote them, but don't spend a lot of time that you are just like giving all of the analysis that they have talked about. But at least the team should have a clear idea as to which argument you're talking about and which analysis you're talking about within that argument. Yeah. Which team weighing metric, how did you resolve the clash? Why did one claim become more important than the other? Yeah. So it's also very, very important when you're like talking within a clash, why did one side win over the other, right? What was the particular reason for that side winning? Was it that they proved their mechanisms better? You have to like also don't be very, very vague and like general in terms of you stating that. State that analysis which you thought was very important. State the things which you thought were persuasive that you actually bought and that went unrebutted within the debate. So even when you're talking within a clash, don't be very, very generic that they had just better analysis, they proved their arguments better. Mention which arguments you're talking about. Why, what is this particular like argument that was persuasive for you? Why was it persuasive for you? Why did it become relevant? And why did it become the tipping point for you to give that clash to one side? So whenever you're talking to a team within a clash, be very, very clear so that they understand what you're talking about, which claim you're talking about, and they understand your reasoning of giving one side over the other. As like Vrinda and Sehaj have already talked about, how you can decide which side is winning a particular clash in itself. Secondly, what's the end impact? Where is it proven better? Obviously, whenever you're doing a clash analysis and you're taking arguments and you're checking them, it's also important to see which side proves it better, what's the end impact of each side. You also have to be comparative. So if I randomly just state out an argument, that doesn't mean that argument doesn't apply in my side, right? If I just say the world is capitalistic, probably the world is still capitalistic in both sides of the world. So you have to be comparative because you have to see the exclusivity of an argument. What is something that they exclusively prove is important or beneficial in their side or harmful in the other side? So this is something that you can take into account when you're doing clash analysis. So you can like convey to the teams on what basis were their arguments not taken into account, or were they not proven, and like were they like not exclusive enough, were they not comparative enough, what was the impact, were they rebutted well in general. So it's important that you talk about all of these things so that you can prove to the teams that what you're talking about is also pretty valid. The second thing to note here is obviously you want to spend a good amount of time on the main clash. You can also still talk about the subsequent clashes, like the subsidiary clashes. You can also talk about the fact that these things are also talked about within the debate. They didn't become like the major thing, but this is also that was talked about. This thing was particularly won by the government. The other subsidiary thing was won by the opposition. But the main thing, which was the main contestation, was won by one side. So obviously, you also have to note that even, for example, if there are 3 clashes within this debate, even though government can win 2 clashes, that doesn't mean that they win the debate, right? So it's not on the quantity of clashes that you decide a team is winning. It's on the severity and the importance and the relevance of that clash. So even though I, as a government, I could win 4 or 5 random clashes about many things, I could have made many arguments, which probably went uncontested. But if that is not the most important thing, that is not the most relevant thing, that is not the most important clash, I could win 4 or 5 clashes, but I still cannot win the debate. So this is why it's very, very important for teams to understand why you're discarding their clashes, why you're discarding their arguments, why you don't think those are the most important things, right? So for example, if I as a team made 4 arguments, but like only contestation was on one, I'll obviously have a question. Why weren't my other three arguments taken into account? What is the specific reason they weren't relevant within this debate? So if you don't talk about these things within your OA, you'll get lower marks because teams will be unsatisfied. Like, just look at it from the perspective of a debater. If you're a debater and you had made four arguments, the judge randomly comes and talks about one argument. You'll keep wondering, why weren't my other arguments taken into account? I literally made three arguments. So you probably, as a debater, start feeling unheard. You start feeling unsatisfied, and you'll probably mark the judge lower, which is to say, if the judge ka scale is 1 to 10, you'll give them a 3. You'll give the judge a 4 instead of giving them a 9 or a 10. So as a judge, when when you're communicating your justification, just ensure that you're not discarding and ignoring any argument. You can mention that that even though government talked about this didn't become the most important thing for this particular reasons, but still state them to a degree. And you can then like spend most of your time on the most important arguments. Why was it the most important clash in general? Thirdly, MOV. Your OA should reflect the closeness of your call, or that it is a clear debate. Yeah. So this is important for your like oral adjudication to be consistent. Don't lie in your margin of victory. Just to get marks, don't say it was very close, because when you're justifying and giving reasons, probably the teams will get to know that it wasn't very close, because if it was very close, the like clashes would have been split and not all clashes would be won by a degree, right? So just be like truthful and honest in that sense, that your OA should reflect the closeness of your call. Obviously, like if your margin of victory is close to clear, notionally it can vary a bit, numerically it can vary a bit, but it should still be in a general sense going and tilting towards a close to clear call and not towards a thrashing call, because that creates inconsistencies within your OA, and that is how you lose marks. Fourth, provide space and time for questioning. All right. So questioning is also a very important part of your oral adjudication, because this is where teams get to interact with you, right? For example, if you start with your oral adjudication, which is your feedback, if it is for 5 to 6 minutes, the questioning becomes the most important, because the questioning is the basis on which the teams decide your marks, right? It's not just that you gave a reason and the teams agree. If the team has a question and you're able to answer that question well, then the teams are even more satisfied, and the teams are even willing to give you higher scores like 8 or 9 or 10 in general. So given that in an oral adjudication you have a limited time, which is for example 7 minutes 20 seconds के आसपास का time होता है, just have at least 30 seconds to a minute for taking questions, right? So you can like try and complete your own justification by 5:45, by 6, by 6:15 at maximum, and then leave out at least 1 minute so you can take questions from them. Obviously, you don't have to take many questions that like the team just keeps asking you 4 to 5 questions. You can take 1, 2, 3 questions. But if you think that it's becoming very redundant and the teams are just trying to heckle you, or the teams are just very pissed off, etc., you don't have to like just keep engaging with them कि मैं आपकी हर question को answer करूंगा. You obviously have to be very polite to them. You don't want to be rude to them, and even if they are rude, we have external mechanisms in like a tournament that you can reach out to. But you as a person who is representing this college, you don't want to be rude to them. So even when a person is rude to you, you don't want to be rude to them. You can report them to the equity team, which can take action against them. But just ensure that your own decorum is something that you try and maintain also. Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. All right. So these are general things that you need to keep in mind when you're giving an OA. So these become very important because they determine your literal performance in the tournament. All right, I'll start with the first one. Be comparative. What points were more persuasive on the winning side? Explanation of strengths and weaknesses of teams has to always be comparative. All right, so it's very important for you to be comparative because your reasoning cannot be inexclusive. For example, you cannot buy an argument which like occurs equally on both sides of the world. Obviously, when you're giving a justification, there has to be some specific thing which is better on one particular side, some specific thing which is worse on a particular side. So whenever you're giving an oral adjudication, you have to be comparative because teams need to understand why this argument probably isn't valid in their paradigm, why this argument wasn't bought from their side in their paradigm. So you have to explain things in a comparative manner, because debates happen in a comparative manner, because both sides are defending a particular like nature of the world, because both sides are defending a particular binary. So you have to be clear in what is this particular thing that is getting better at the other side, so you can prove that why it's getting worse on the other side, right? So it cannot be like if there is an argument, it's equally likely on both sides and you bought that. Obviously it happens on a comparative, and that there is something exclusively, for example, if you are giving the win to a one particular side, there is one thing that exclusively gets better on that side, or there is one harm that doesn't exist on that side. So what is this degree is something that you need to like prove and also take into account. So whenever you're giving reasoning, just be comparative. Just try to look at it from both sides of the world, from government's and opposition's view, so you can give a more holistic judgment and reasoning as well. Secondly, be specific. Yeah, I think I've already stated this, but this is very, very important. Whenever you are stating something, don't be like, I needed more reasoning. Your arguments needed to be more persuasive. Tell me which particular thing are you talking about, right? So even within a clash, even within an argument, what is this particular thing that needed more analysis? What is this particular thing that needed to be more persuasive? Because this is where teams can start to get at least some amount of idea of what they were lacking, of what they were missing, so they can probably like do better later on as well. So if teams don't even know which argument or which analysis you're talking about, they'll be very, very confused and they'll mark you accordingly. So you have to be very specific, you have to be careful in what you're talking about, and you have to mention which particular thing you're talking about. If you don't do that, they won't get clarity and they won't mark you. Thirdly, choose your language carefully. No offensive comments. Do not make fun of speakers. Be respectful at all times. All right. Yeah. So this in general is very, very important. You don't have to make fun of speakers. You only need to talk about the case. You have to take that into account, not only just as an adjudicator, but also as someone who's representing our institution. We don't want there to be negative perception of our institution and our adjudicators on how they judge, on how they interact with the teams, because obviously we are still people outside of debating. It's just an activity we do. We are still trying to enjoying the activity. We are still trying to get better. So it's important that you don't make targeted comments. You're not rude to teams, and you are not making fun of the speaker, that this particular speaker was very bad. Not only does it mean that you'll get lower scores, but it also means that the perception of you and your college is going to get ruined. So just be very, very careful, because you and your institution is on display whenever you're interacting with anyone. You have to be very, very respectful, even if the other person is not respectful. Fourthly, don't be constructive. All right. When explaining the decision, stick to what happened in the round. Offer suggestions for improvement later. This is very, very important. Whenever you are giving reasoning, teams get very, very annoyed if you just start giving random feedback. You could have brought this argument, you could have done this, you could have done that. They just want to know what happened in the debate and why they lost, right? What was the reasoning? Why weren't their arguments bought? Why was the other side better? Whenever you are giving an oral adjudication, don't start resort to giving like constructives. You can give constructives later on. After the teams have marked you, they can reach out to you for personal feedback. Then you can give constructives. Then you can be like, you could have brought this argument, you could have done that, you could have done this, right? But try, whenever you are in an oral adjudication, from the perspective of you talking about what happened within the debate. Why wasn't this bought? Why was this bought? Don't be very, very constructive, very, very critical, in the sense that you are like judging the quality of their arguments, and teams are like, please tell me why I lost, and you're like, you could have done this in your argument. That's something that pisses teams off, and that something that means that they'll also mark you lower as well. Yeah. And obviously you can offer suggestions later on. And this is something that's also important. For example, when you finish your oral adjudication and you open the floor for questions, sometimes the questions that teams ask are also constructive in nature. So for example, your oral adjudication was of 6 minutes. You finished your oral adjudication and you opened the floor for questions. These questions are only specific to what happened within your oral adjudication. But sometimes what happens is teams generally start asking feedback within those questions. What you can then tell the team is, all right, I'll take the feedback later on, and you can mark me on the basis of my oral adjudication. Then you can reach out to me for personal feedback and I will give you that feedback, right? So even within the questions, some teams might ask you to be constructive, might ask for feedback. You don't have to do that within the question. You can tell them that you can mark me. If you have any questions on the verdict, you can ask. If you don't, just give me a score and we can like have a like personal chat, informal chat, and I'll give you constructives. I'll give you feedback later on. A critical thing to note here is, even when they're asking questions, don't be very constructive and very feedbacky based, right? Don't be very, very critical in terms of what they're talking about, because that is something that you can later do in like personal feedback as well. As an adjudicator who's giving oral adjudication, it's important for you to justify your verdict and talk about what happened within the motion. Personal feedback can come later, and that should be the priority. Even if in a question or team asks you for personal feedback, just state, I'll give it to you later. Just like, this is something that you can keep in mind. All right. Fifthly, spend an equal amount of time on both sides. Yeah. So this is important, because what happens certain times is you give loss to a particular team and you start thinking that I'll just talk to the losing team only, right? Because winning team to jeet gayi, they'll anyways give me marks. I can just talk to the losing team and justify my verdict for 7 minutes. But that's not how it works. Because even as the winning team, I want to know what is the particular thing I did. I want to know what is the particular clash that happened. So try to spend at least equal time or close to equal time on talking about both sides, on talking about both winning and losing side. So for example, even when you're talking within the clash, you can talk about what is the thing that the winning team did which made them win. Then you can also talk about, and you can compare within losing side and winning side. But it's also important to incorporate what they talked about, the arguments they made, and from their perspective as well. So it's your job to be holistic. It's your job to talk about both sides, losing and winning, and try to spend at least close to an equal time. Obviously, if a team lost, you might think that I can spend a little more time, but you have to be as close as possible. In certain situations, you might think that I might need to do a little bit more on justifying to the losing team. That's fine on a marginal sense, but still be as close to as equal as possible. You don't want to include, you don't want to completely ignore the perspective of the like winning team. Winning team also wants to know why they won, and that's something you should also take into account. All right. Balance positive and critical comments if possible. Yeah. So this is important because, for example, if you debated for an hour and you're listening to a judge, and the judge is just very, very negative, the judge is just very, very critical. The judge isn't talking about anything that you did and just very, very critical and negative in general. I think that notice how even as a debater, that's something that you probably won't like. And even as an adjudicator, it's your job. Obviously, you want to mention the flaws and the gaps that were present in their arguments, but you can also be positive in the ways you're approaching, because not only it's better, because strategically you can also get some scores from the teams, and also because the teams get to know what is the what are the particular things that they did well also. Obviously, you don't have to be constructive in this. You're still talking about clashes. You're still talking about what happened within the debate. What are the arguments that were made? So you're still referring back to that, but you can still talk about it in the sense of this is something that these are like arguments were made by the government, and that is something that was missing and like lacking from these arguments in general. So try to like incorporate both of these styles. You obviously have to be critical at certain times within your oral adjudication, because you are trying to point out flaws within an argument. You're trying to prove why this side loses towards the other side. But you can also be positive in a manner that you can still acknowledge the arguments that were made, and you can still talk about it from that perspective as well. Obviously, you don't have to lie. It's not that the debate was very bad and you're just positive throughout. Be critical also. So this is something that you have to do like on a relative basis. It's, for example, if a debate was very, very bad, you cannot just come here and like outrightly lie, because obviously you don't want to do that even as an adjudicator, because you want to fairly represent what happened within the debate. Even though you want scores, you want to be fair in terms of your representation of what happened. So it's important that you're being positive and you're also being critical. Just don't shift directly and like don't shift most of your time towards one thing. Try to do both as well. Do not disclose speaker scores. All right. So this is interesting, because what happens after your oral adjudication is many times teams ask for your speaker scores. Many times teams are curious. What were the speaker scores that we got? Right. What are the exact scores that we got? What was the range that we got? It's as the judge up to your discretion whether you want to give it to them. In most cases, you don't want to ever reveal the quantitative scores that you give, because if teams get to know that, they'll use that as a basis to mark you, right? So for example, if you gave a team a 74 and you're like, I gave you 74, 75, teams can use that as a basis to be pissed off and mark you on the basis of that, right? So you have to be strategic here. You don't have to ever reveal the speaker scores. That's up to your own discretion. What you can do at maximum is you can just tell them that the speaks range from above average, average to above average, slightly above average, etc., etc. If it's slightly below average, you don't even have to mention that, because if you mention it's slightly below average, teams can probably get pissed, right? So you have to be strategic here. You don't have to give your quantitative speaks, and if the speech is below average, you don't even have to directly mention that it's below average. And like that's something that you can take into account, but make sure that you're never revealing the quantitative figure. Teams will be like, हमें range बता दो, हमें speaks मत बताओ, हमें बताओ bottom क्या था, top क्या था. You don't even need to give that. This is something I also do. So for example, when I'm debating, I ask the judges कि मुझे range बता दो, just so I can know and like understand what they did. A lot of times they tell me the range, but they don't have to. So as a judge, just remember, when a team is asking you this question, you don't reveal them the speaker scores. At best, what you can do is say that the debate was average to above average, the debate was very above average. If it's below average, you don't even need to mention that. Obviously, you can show it within your scores as well, but just in terms of you have to be a bit strategic. In terms, after they have marked you and you're going for personal feedback, you can be very, very critical, right? But and you can like in that sense be very, very constructive. But when you are giving an oral adjudication, you don't have to like obviously mention that I gave 71 speaks, I gave 72 speaks, etc. Again, this doesn't mean that you are positive about every debate. You have to be critical. You have to talk about the gaps within their like speeches. It doesn't mean that a person gave a 71 speech and you are coming in oral adjudication, you're like they gave a very good speech. You have to be honest. You have to give a fair representation of what happened. This is something that's very important. And you have to still be critical in terms of how you're talking about their arguments, what were the logics they were missing, what were the gaps in their arguments. You don't have to lie, you have to be very honest, and that's where like that's also very, very important. Don't forget that when I'm talking about this. Yeah, I think we can move on to the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, learning and improving. I think this is pretty simple. How can you improve? Number one, best way to practice is to judge more. Obviously, if you want to get better in an activity, you need to do that activity also. So we'll start with your mocks pretty soon. You can also sign up to like judge there as well. There will be many opportunities that will come your way to judge and to debate. So try and take them. Try and take those opportunities as well as you can. Try and be available whenever we are asking you to do mocks or like judge debates as well. Just be available. Secondly, ask teams for feedback. All right, so this is particularly for like in tournaments also, in like mock debates also. After you have like given your justification, after the teams have marked you, you can also reach out to the teams. What did you think about my oral adjudication? What did you think was missing? So you can try and take feedback from them as well. Ask the judge who heard your OA for feedback. All right, so for example, if you're in a tournament, like some judges went before you, those judges were sitting in your room, you can still ask them for your like constructive, for your feedback. Just tell me what was missing. Ask the chair for how they got better at judging. All right, so if you're in a tournament and you're like chair is the one like which is chair is the one which is like the one who's like controlling the whole room, and their vote has more value. I don't know if you know what a chair is. I'll just describe it anyway. So for example, in a tournament, if there are three things that are existing: chairs, panelists, and trainees. Trainees don't have a vote. Even though you might give it to government and opposition, obviously you still go ahead and give your oral adjudication to the like teams. You don't have a vote in the real verdict. If you're a trainee, you're still in the training phase, and that's something that you don't have. As a panelist and as a chair, you are a voting member. Voting member means that your decision directly influences whether the team actually wins or loses. Even though, for example, even though the trainee think one side is winning, if the panelist and chair think the other side is winning, they still can go ahead and like do that, right? So chair is important. For example, if there is an even panel, if there's one chair and one panel, the panel gave it to government, the chair gave it to opposition. Chair becomes important because chair is the tiebreaker. So chair is important because the chair acts as a tiebreaker if in terms of like the vote is equally split. If the panel is odd, obviously the chair cannot be the tiebreaker because it's an odd panel. But that's something that's what a chair is. So obviously chairs are someone who are very, very experienced in general, who have like achievements and who have done like tournaments before. So that is why they were made the chair, because the chair, being a chair, is an important job. So if you're on their panel or if you're a trainee within their round, what you can also do is reach out to the chairs, how they got better. You can ask them for feedback. You can ask them for what resources did they use, etc., etc. So these are things that you can take into account and incorporate. Obviously, you can also ask us as seniors. We'll also be there for you. But in tournaments, you can also ask your chairs. They can also help you. I think like this is done. And next slide. Yeah. All right. So this is just the acknowledgement and credits. We can move on to the other side. Thank you for joining. Any questions? I'll just wait for at least 2 to 3 minutes. If you don't have a question, you can leave. Thank you so much for coming in and joining. How can we be positive while not being constructive? All right. Okay. So when you're being positive and acha, if we can go on to the last slide. Chirag, you jana? जहाँ पे वो चीजें mentioned थी. Some things to take note of. Back bus यहाँ पे. Yeah, balance positive and critical comments. All right, so being constructive is different, because when you're being constructive, you're critically evaluating their speech and you're critically evaluating what they could have brought. So for example, when you're judging and when you're judging the debate, you might have thoughts that they could have brought but they didn't. Obviously, when you are doing this, you're not being like within the like restraints of a debate, because you're talking about arguments that weren't even made within the debate, right? So when you're being constructive, you're providing feedback, but you're also talking about things that didn't happen within the debate. So for example, when you're being constructive to a person, you can be like, you made this argument, but I didn't like this argument, you could have brought the other argument as well. That's where you are being constructive to their own argument. But when you are a judge who's judging that, you still have to judge that argument, even though you didn't like that argument, even though you think there's a better argument to be made. But as a judge, you still have to judge that argument. So positive means that you can still you still have to talk about the arguments that they were made. Were they able to prove their own arguments? Were they able to justify that? Were there logical gaps within that arguments? So if they were able to prove their arguments that they made within the like debate that happened, you can still mention that that argument was well proven, and like if that argument was winning or not, that you can justify. So positive points from the arguments heard, yeah, essentially. So being constructive is also about you talking about things that just didn't happen. So you have to avoid that, because teams just want to know what happened and how did they win or did they lose. So you cannot be, so whenever you're being positive or you're being critical, you have to be positive and critical about what they did, what they said. When you're being constructive, you're not restricted to what they said or what they did. You can go beyond that. You can be like, you could have done this, you could have done that. This is an informal interaction you can do later with the teams later on. Yeah. Any other question? Pawali, is that clear? I hope. Yeah, all right. So I'll just still wait. If you don't have any questions, you can leave. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. I'll wait for 2 to 3 minutes at least.
Thank you. Today was a good session, and that break was much required in between.
Yeah,
Thank
no
you.
worries, no worries.